And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, tonight we're watching a low track east-northeastward up here toward the Alaska Peninsula, and higher pressure building in over the Yukon. Tomorrow will direct this system northward, and that'll make for another windy day here across south central Alaska with pretty gusty winds, especially through the Chugach Mountains, Turnagain Arm area, as well as Cook Inlet up into the Anchorage-Palmer area, as well as the Western Alaska Range here. And there is a high wind watch out for tomorrow and tomorrow evening for the central and western Alaska Range, for possible wind gusts of 45 miles an hour. And for areas from Galena to McGrath and that general area, there's a winter storm watch out for possible 4 to 7 inches of snow with this thing as it comes northward. Otherwise, pretty strong high pressure dries it out over the southeast coast, improving conditions out here over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. And then on Wednesday, next front pushes wind and rain into the Aleutians there, as far east as probably Unalaska Island late in the day, with a break here for the Alaska Peninsula, northeast Bering Sea. This low tracks northward, weakens with some snow shower activity up over the Seward Peninsula, northwest part of the state. Another system here moves up to just east of Kodiak Island, spreading more wind and rain into south central Alaska, especially along the northeastern North Gulf Coast and northern Panhandle area. Coastal water forecast for tomorrow, not bad. West-northwest breeze there for the south coast at 10 knots. Westerlies 15 knots for the central coast, and variable winds at 10 knots for the north coast. South winds 10 knots for Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage. Light variable winds for Clarence Strait. And then on Wednesday, east winds 30 knots here for most of the coastline. Extreme north coast, east 45 knots, seas building to 20 feet there. Otherwise, southeast to 20 for Clarence Strait, and looking at northeast winds 25 to 40 knots for Stevens Passage. North winds 20 knots for Lynn Canal with 3-foot seas. Prince William Sound for Tuesday, southeast winds at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Otherwise, south winds 25 knots for the North Gulf Coast with seas 8 to 11 feet. Gale warnings, Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, southeast winds 35 knots. And southern Cook Inlet, south winds at 30 knots with 10-foot seas. And north of the Forelands, winds southeasterly at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. And then for Wednesday, winds swing around to the north for Cook Inlet, pick up considerably, north 30 knots for northern Cook Inlet. Gale warning south of the Forelands to Kamishak Bay and the Barrens, all out of the north at 35 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast, east-northeast winds 40 to 50 knots there, strongest east of Middleton Island. And Prince William Sound, gale warnings, east winds 35 knots with 9-foot seas in the forecast. Kodiak Island tomorrow, south winds 30 to 35 knots. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, south 35 knots for the winds there, and west-southwest 15 to 20 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And for Wednesday, winds for the Alaska Peninsula here, west-southwest 15 to 20 knots. Northwest 20 knots for Bristol Bay, and west-northwesterlies at 30 knots there for Kodiak Island with 11 to 8-foot seas. Central eastern Aleutians, west winds 25 to 30 knots, and not much different out here to the west. West winds 25 to 30 knots as well. And then for Wednesday, gale warnings with that next front swinging in. We've got south to southeast winds 40 knots from Shimia all the way toward Nikolsky. And then on Alaska Island, lighter southwest winds at 25 knots with 5 to 6-foot seas. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, south to southwest winds 15 knots, southeast winds, south to southeast winds for the southwest coast at 15 knots. St. Lawrence Island southeast at 20 knots, Norton Sound southeast 15, and south 25 for St. Matthew Island, southwest at 20 with 10-foot seas for St. Paul and St. George. And for Wednesday, southwest 25-knot winds for the Pribilofs, and we've got easterly at 20 knots there for St. Matthew Island. In the southwest coast, southeast winds 10 to 15 knots, southeast 15 St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound, southeast winds 15 knots. Central eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, west-southwest winds 20 knots, western Arctic coast, same thing, southwest at 20. And then we've got southeast winds 15 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And then for the day on Wednesday, Chukchi Sea here, light northeast winds at about 10 knots with 2-foot seas. Otherwise, the western Arctic coast, east at 10 knots, east 15 knots for the central coast, eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 15 to 20 knots.